a small peace group in the European Parliament. They invited me to speak. A former colleague of mine, now member of Parliament of the European Parliament, Michael van der Schulenburg, who was an exceptional leader at the UN and someone that was involved in many conflicts around the world and in trying to end them. So he's very much on the path of peace. Co-leads a small group of parliamentarians, because most of the mainstream parties in Europe are still war parties. And so this was a great occasion to talk to the parliamentarians, because they came from across the political factions and at least listened politely to me. And since then, there's been a lot of feedback. My main point was that the United States basically just seriously messed up from the late 1980s until the last few weeks, actually, because, and I saw it with my own eyes. I was an economic advisor to Gorbachev's economic team in 1990, 91. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin's economic team in 1991 to 1993. I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma of Ukraine in 1993, 94. I've seen it from both sides. I've been called in by Ukraine since then on occasions. After the Maidan, the government asked me to come in. So I learned a bit of awful stuff about the Maidan as well, by personal sight of what was going on. The upshot of all of this was that Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the world at that time, the Soviet world and the Russian Federation, said, let's end the Cold War, let's have peace. And the United States could not think in that term. The United States said, oh, we get it. We won, you lost. We do what we want. It's now the unipolar world. And I think the Soviets and the Russians said, no, that's not exactly what we mean. Why don't we have peace and cooperation? And the United States said, yeah, we get it. We win, you lose, we do what we want. This is the essence of the 30 years from 1990 onward. The United States decided, well, we have all the power. We can be a bully. We can do what we want. We can go back on any commitments made. We can overthrow governments. We can back out of the nuclear arms framework, whatever we want. We are America. So that's my summary in very simple terms. In particular, starting in 1990, February 7th, 1990, the United States and Germany, in the context of German reunification, told the Soviet leadership and Mikhail Gorbachev to his face in absolutely explicit terms that our governments have lied about ever since. NATO will not move 1 inch eastward in the context of the Soviet Union ending the Warsaw Pact military alliance and in the context of German reunification. There was a basic deal. Germany will reunify, because that was a legal agreement that needed to be reached to end World War II, actually, in 1990. World War II was not ended by a treaty. It was ended by the 4+2 process in 1990 to reunify Germany. One of the reasons for the Cold War, in fact, was that there was no treaty after World War II because the Western alliance didn't want a treaty. The Soviet Union said, let's have a neutral, demilitarized Germany. The West said, no, we will remilitarize Germany. We will create NATO. We will create the Federal Republic of Germany without a treaty. The Soviet Union said, but our security. And the West said at that time, back in the 1940s, not your security, it's our NATO. Okay. Well, there was no end to World War II until 1990 from a diplomatic and juridical point of view. And in that context, the commitment was NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Soviet Union ended in 1991, as we know, in December. I was almost in the room when that happened because I was literally sitting in front of Boris Yeltsin. I don't know if we talked about this before, but in December 1991, I led an economic delegation to speak with President Yeltsin. He came from the back of a room in the Kremlin, sat down directly in front of me because I was leading the delegation. And he said, "Gentlemen, I can announce the Soviet Union is over." So I heard it with my own ears to my face. That moment. Oh, I assured him the West will be overjoyed and give him all the financial help for stabilization and so forth. That's what I thought. Rather naive. Of course, the United States did not lift a finger to help this new democratization, this transformation, this historic moment, because while President Yeltsin was trying to grapple with the profound economic crisis, the United States was saying, we won, you lost, we do what we want. And there was absolutely no sense in Washington that this was an opportunity for sustained peace other than the unipolar U.S. world. So the story I said in the European Parliament was immediately the U.S. planned to break its promise and to expand NATO. Bill Clinton, who followed George Bush Sr. In 1994, made the decision, and it was a decision we learned from the historians to go all the way to Ukraine. Already then, the idea was NATO, we go as far as we want. And we know that the U.S. deep state had the vision from then onward that just like the Soviet Union fell apart, we will help Russia to fall apart. Russia can disintegrate into its ethnic nations. Brzezinski in 1997 talked about Russia becoming a confederation of 3 loosely connected parts, a European part, a Siberian part, and an East Asian part. The grandiosity of the Western vision had no limits. This was, after all, the end of history, as we were told. And the end of history was American hegemony. Well, it did not go well. The Europeans, by the way, knew something's off with this. They didn't just quietly go along. We should remember that as late as 2003, we had European politicians saying no to the war in Iraq, which was a war on absolutely fake premises. It was a war that Bibi Netanyahu talked the U.S. into doing on behalf of Israel. This is what that war was about. And the Europeans, they didn't support it. The Germans opposed it. The French opposed it. Of course, the British went along. Sorry to say, they always go along, partly because they always go along and partly because Britain never saw a war it didn't like. This is part of the British imperial nostalgia. But the continental Europeans opposed the Iraq War. But that was basically the last time they opposed the United States. And in this grandiosity of the United States, this expansion of NATO, which came in waves, first Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, second wave in 2004 was the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Balkan states, Bulgaria and Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia, Central Europe and the Balkans. That's when President Putin said, "Stop already. You lied to us, you cheated, but do not come closer." And of course, these maniac neocons listened to President Putin and said, "Oh, he doesn't want us to come closer, so we must continue," is the American thinking. 2008 was the showdown in Bucharest at the NATO summit. That was the last moment that Europe had a foreign policy. In the first day of the NATO summit, Merkel and Sarkozy opposed the call by George Bush Jr. To announce a plan for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. The next day, they folded their hands by agreeing that NATO would announce, albeit without a timeline and a plan, that Ukraine would become a NATO member. To my mind, that was the last moment there was a European foreign policy. After that moment, everything was in lockstep with the US neocons. And a whole generation of European politicians rose up, cultivated by US money, cultivated by the military-industrial complex network of so-called think tanks, which are the opposite of think tanks. They are the no think tank, please. Do not have any independent thinking. The Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, all of these places basically became neocon breeding grounds for Europe's political class. And we didn't hear a peep. Interestingly, I catch glimpses of all of this. I'm an economist. I'm not in the security world. But European leaders tell me things because I speak, to the top leadership, usually about economic matters. But after Bucharest, one of the European leaders said to me, "Can't believe what your president did. So reckless. We know how dangerous this is, but not a peep in public." This is the great lie to the European people. In private, they say this was terrible. In public, yes, we follow the US line. Yes, NATO will enlarge. And of course, we know the sequence of events after that. The US paid for most of perhaps the Maidan insurrection, the violent coup. The U.S. was deeply involved in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. I'm sure we'll learn a lot more about that in the years ahead. I happened to catch a glimpse of that also by someone explaining to me after the Maidan, but on the Maidan, while people were still milling around, because I was called in to meet with the new government. And I went because I went as a courtesy because I had advised beforehand. And somebody explained to me how much money the Americans put into the Maidan insurrection. Really unpleasant stuff. I couldn't stand it. It just, it was god-awful to think about yet another U.S. regime change operation. One more thing to add to the mix that I emphasized in the European Parliament. Not only did the U.S. expand NATO, not only did it engage in multiple wars of choice, many of them, by the way, on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu and Israel's what I regard as absolutely extremist agenda. But the U.S. did one other thing that was at least as consequential, probably much more consequential, and underemphasized. And that is that in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was a complete foundational bulwark of nuclear arms control, because the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was part of a framework to prevent one side or another from attempting or achieving a first strike capability on the other, a decapitation strike. The idea is if you don't have anti-ballistic missiles, or if you have just a few of them, then if you attack, the other side will be able to counterattack, and you won't have the anti-ballistic missiles to protect your side. So thereby there will be nuclear deterrence. But in 2002, the United States abandoned the basic concept of nuclear deterrence and said, no, we do what we want. We put anti-ballistic missiles where we want, starting in Poland, then in Romania, and then absolutely consequentially telling the Russians, yeah, even in Ukraine, if we want, which is apparently what Antony Blinken told Foreign Minister Lavrov in January 2022, according to the former CIA analyst and wonderful person and analyst Ray McGovern. So, three fundamental aspects of U.S. foreign policy: expand NATO forever, surround Russia in the Black Sea region, keep the U.S. military expanding, number one; regime change operations and wars of choice, number two; and three, abandon the nuclear arms control framework. That's the basis of why we ended up in this disaster in Ukraine. That's what I told the European Parliament. Of course, they don't hear a word of this in the mainstream media. This is all documented, known to historians, known to people who have been involved in this, known to me as an economist who has been involved in this region for more than 30 years, because it's right there to look at if someone would look at it. And my main message to the European parliamentarians is, for God's sake, get a foreign policy, learn the history, understand how you've been walked into this disaster. Well, I told them all of that. Here comes President Trump and says, we'll end the disaster. Thank you. This is this 30-year neocon failure. I think for Trump, the main thing is it's a failure. Ukraine's getting destroyed. One of the, by the way, just as a quick digression, I think one of the clever but true things that is a common quip is that the Russians play chess and the Americans play poker. And I think that this is basically right. The Russians are looking at the long term. The Americans are bluffing. The Americans are playing a hand. And the neocons were a mix of delusion and bluff. But there was a lot of bluff in it. There was the idea, Russia can't do anything. We're so good. We're so powerful. They're going to fold. They're going to fold. At every step, the idea was they're going to fold. We're going to warn them. No SWIFT banking system. We're going to warn them. HIMARS. We're going to warn them. ATACMS. They're going to fold their hand. Americans, it's filled with idiocy. I'm telling you, it's something to behold. So that's the story I told them. It's a correct rendering of history. It's extraordinarily sad. And the perversity of all of this is that now there's an exit ramp. Now Europe could get its act together, but to this moment, it refuses to do so.
So just a few quick points. Firstly, the most important thing to take away from your speech for me is that this crisis that we have in international relations is the product of purposeful, intentional foreign policy. In other words, of positive choices. I mean, there's going to be people who say that we drifted into this, we made all kinds of mistakes, we acted in good faith, we got drawn into a quagmire. Nothing of the sort. We actually, and I say we because we Europeans are accessories in it, we actually made positive decisions that has directly led to this. In that respect, I have to say, I think your speech, Professor Sachs, to the European Parliament, it reminds me of the Pentagon Papers. Again, the Pentagon Papers showed the stages in which the United States made a series of decisions, purposeful decisions, that led to the crisis in Vietnam, the crisis in Southeast Asia. This, on an even bigger scale, led, again, was every bit as purposeful. And, well, you were a witness to these events, a direct witness. You were with Yeltsin. You spoke to these European leaders. You talked to players, decision makers like Jake Sullivan. I'd like to get onto that in a moment.
Yeah.
So, there is enormous weight and authority in what you say. You also describe what you saw in Kiev directly after Maidan, what people said to you. The most extraordinary thing, people on the eve of the events in South Sudan. You saw things there which were extraordinary things. The presence of the Americans there, and American senators and CIA agents and all the usual spooks and all of those people there. So this is an authoritative statement of policy, of what was going on. And we also have, this curtain lifting sometimes under those debates. And one of them was that debate that you mentioned in our previous program we did with you, the one in the National Security Council, rejecting your very affordable plan to stabilize the financial system in Russia, which, by the way, I remember at the time. And the amounts of money were small. I mean, relative to what we've been spending, they're infinitely small. It would not have cost a lot at all. But
no, and Alexander, just to say about that, as we talked about it, when I read the minutes of this National Security Council meeting, June 3rd, 1991, I was stunned at how idiotic these Americans were. But I can tell you the worst of them, the very worst, was a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School of Government, a man named Richard Darman, who was at the time the head of the Office of Management and Budget. And when people read this stuff, which they will read, Darman talks about, well, we have to do a PR stunt. We have to do PR to show that we care, but we're going to do the minimal possible. And then he and another economist named Michael Boskin at Stanford are the two ringleaders to say the reforms are impossible. They're just impossible. We're not going to do anything. We have to be Machiavellian in this. We have to do the least possible. Gorbachev's a showman. You look at this stuff and you cry because it's so ignorant. And also, how can a government work at a pivotal moment like this? They should have given me a phone call, for God's sake. Talk about it. They should have talked to Grigory Yavlinsky, who was still a leading politician in Russia and was the advisor of Gorbachev. They didn't even lift a finger. They just knew. And that's the American arrogance. They just know the truth. They don't have to talk to anybody. They don't have to study anything. They don't have to listen to the other side. They just know. And that's what comes out of this. And in terms of cost, by the way, I'll tell you one more story. In November 1991, after the putsch that had taken Gorbachev down, but a month before the end of the Soviet Union formally, Yeltsin was already the dominant political figure. Soviet Union was on its way of ending, and Yeltsin was the leader at the time. Gorbachev was already basically in the shadows and on his way out. And Yeltsin's economic advisor, who became an acting prime minister after that, Yegor Gaidar, asked me to come to Moscow to talk to him and his team about the urgent economic situation. So I went to the dacha outside of Moscow and I talked with them. And in November of 1991, the Soviet Union had debts falling due, and they were running out of reserves. This was a financial crisis. This was also a revolution, but it was a financial crisis, a very acute financial crisis. So I've been involved in lots of financial crises on how to end them, and I've successfully helped to end several. And I said the most standard thing in the cookbook, the first thing you learn about this is a standstill on debt repayments pending a stabilization program. So the so-called G7 deputies were on their way. That's the finance minister deputies, led by the United States, of course. And I said to Gaidar, okay, ask them for a debt standstill. And I waited in the outside room as he went in and met the G7 deputies in November 1991. And he came out an hour later, ashen-faced. And I said, Yegor, what happened? And he said, they told me if we don't pay every penny on time, they will stop the food shipments that are on the high seas right now. They threatened the Soviet Union. They threatened the Russians. You must spend down every penny of your foreign exchange reserves. This is madness. in the context of the end of the Cold War, trying to make peace, democratization, the United States is demanding something they wouldn't even demand in normal times, that every penny must be paid at every moment. So the stupidity is a big part of it, but it's the deliberateness of it that is, like you say, shocking. This is not accident. This is a combination of arrogance and stupidity.
And cynicism. I mean, when people start quoting or bragging that they're going to be Machiavellian, I mean, what is that if not an admission of cynicism? And the same about the conversation you had with Jake Sullivan. Ukraine will never join NATO, but we can't say that in public. We're going to. I mean, it is. By the way, I remember. I was
standing out, and I was skiing that day. I'm standing out in the freezing cold on my mobile, and I said, "Jake, we're going to have a war over something that isn't actually going to happen, and you're not going to say it." And he said, "Jeff, don't worry. There's going to be diplomacy. There's going to be no war." Of course, that's the man who said 2 weeks before October 7th, 2023, that the Middle East is the most quiet and stable that it's been for 2 decades. That's our political leadership, for God's sake. And he couldn't predict a war in a month, and he couldn't understand what was happening in the Middle East, and he's our national security advisor.
Absolutely. Just to finish, go and read that speech. This is my advice to everybody who's watching this program. Read that speech through. Try and get the whole text, because there are condensed versions. Listen to it, because it is, as I said, it sets it all out. It does so very clearly, and it shows us that it's intentional all the way, and it has led us to catastrophe. And just to say, on that promise not to extend NATO eastwards, I have memory. I remember watching Hans-Dietrich Genscher going on British television, be interviewed about this, saying not an inch east. I remember reading articles in all the newspapers that now deny that promise was ever made. The Guardian, the Times, the Financial Times, they're all talking about it at the time. As I said, I remember it. I mean, it's always astonished me that people pretend that promise was never given. Whether the people who gave that promise were acting in good faith, that I don't know. But that the promise was made, of that there is no doubt at all. I leave the last word to you, Jeffrey, obviously, just as we have, a time point to finish.
Probably the best book on American foreign policy in maybe a half century plus was a book by then Senate chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the United States, J. William Fulbright, in the mid-1960s, called The Arrogance of Power. And he used that title to explain the Vietnam War. And that arrogance did not end. And that is really the point. In fact, it went into hyperdrive with the end of the Cold War, so-called end of the Cold War, let's say with the end of the Soviet Union. The United States could not understand peace and mutual respect. To tell you the truth, I don't know whether we are at the end of that hyper arrogance or not. I think we're at the end of the war in Ukraine. I'm convinced of it. I think President Trump has this right. There's a lot of deep state forces telling him, no, go back. You got to put on sanctions. You have to recharge Ukraine and so forth. But I think he understands this is completely a losing hand. And I think the Europeans, as foolish and idiotic as they are in their rhetoric right now, can't do anything about it. So the war will end. It could end on the basis of the Istanbul draft agreement, April 15th, 2022, another of these profound missed opportunities, because we could have had 1 million Ukrainian lives saved, people who are dead now or gravely wounded. None of it needed to happen. because even a month after the special military operation started, there was a draft agreement to end it. And the United States and UK, of course, famously said no in their arrogance, in their poker playing. Well, we'll raise the stakes. We'll bluff Russia. They'll never mobilize. They'll fold when they see the economic sanctions and so forth. And that's probably 1 million or more casualties of Ukrainians since that moment. We have other conflicts. I hope we can talk about them soon. The Middle East scares the wits out of me because Israel has controlled U.S. foreign policy for decades. I don't know whether that's over. I want Donald Trump to have an America foreign policy, not an Israel-made foreign policy. If he does, that war could end immediately also, because that's also a war of choice. Do you back Israeli extremism, which the United States has done for 30 years in its arrogance and its foolishness and its recklessness, or do you have peace in the Middle East? So for me, the big question is, are we done with this phase of war making relentlessly in history? One war is going to end soon, Ukraine. The Middle East, it's big stakes, and what will happen with the U.S. and China? Again, there are a lot of arrogant thinkers who could lead the U.S. and the world into complete disaster unless they learn some diplomacy. Final note, I'm hoping that Europe wakes up. It will. It has to. It's so unreal right now. When you're delusional like a cartoon character that's kind of run off the roof, but you're hanging in the air before you look down and you realize there's nothing below, they're going to realize, oh my God, we just gave away our foreign policy for decades, and we need to get back to sanity. We haven't heard a word of it yet in Europe, by the way. What we heard from Macron was the opposite of sane, marching off to war or flying off to war from Starmer, completely nuts. But people are out on the streets now in Paris and elsewhere and in Bucharest. They don't want this anymore. And even though they're being forced into this, these leaders are so unpopular, and the public knows so much better that there will be a change in Europe too, I believe.
I completely agree. Professor Sachs, we're definitely going to have you back. We're going to talk about the Middle East. We're going to talk about some of the proposals, some of the ideas you have about how to arrange the peace in Ukraine, which are very interesting and involve the United Nations. We might ask you perhaps to bring Mr. Schulenberg to discuss those, because he knows so much about that too. That might be an idea, just the thought. But we understand that you have to finish now. I want to thank you again and say that speech to the European Parliament, completely not reported in the mainstream media here in London, by the way, just to say, but all over the internet, everybody's talking about it across the internet. And it will be a historic document. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt at all. When people want to understand what has been happening, not just over the last few years, but over the 30 years that led up to it, they will go to that speech. So thank you, Professor Sachs, and speak to you soon and again.
Great to be with you guys, and thanks so much. Thanks for the fantastic work you guys do every single day. It's absolutely vital, and you've been so right every day. And so I'll be listening in later today.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sachs.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.